going with the Ethereum Foundation. So with that, let me introduce David. David.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Great. Actually, it was funny. That's just a coincidence because we've been working with Ethereum on the sort of mathematical foundations of decentralized contracts. And so it's not what I'm going to talk about at all. It's sort of, and Vitalik's very interested. This is a field that sort of is very hacking based. And a lot of kids in their 20s who live in the Ukraine or in Singapore doing great things, but with no formal foundations. And so we've been asking what the formal foundations of this system could be. But that's not what I'm talking about. It's something vastly off topic. And we'll see if this entertains you. So yeah, for those who don't know, the Santa Fe Institute was founded in 1984 by a group of Nobel laureates. And the idea was, who had been in one way or another associated with the Manhattan Project. So we're in Santa Fe by virtue of Los Alamos. And the idea was, could we take foundational theories in mathematics and computation and apply them to complex systems? Complex systems meaning adaptive systems, economies, brains, ecosystems, and so forth. So I thought what I would do is just provide a little foundational thinking in what really, I think, the modern world of decentralized engineering is about, which is, where does order come from? And how do we think about it formally? What is the history of that in mathematics, in the biological sciences? And I'm going to then give, so that'll be the first half, and I'll try and do that pretty quickly. And then the second half will be 2 examples from our work on systems that might be inspirational. Certainly this is true for Ethereum, which is the nervous system. So we have 86 billion neurons in our head. They're all somehow generating coherent perception and decision-making, and yet they all have independent, non-overlapping sources of information. How does that actually work? How do you coordinate 86 billion units to do this? And then a little bit on how you can reconceptualize society in terms of computational circuitry. And I'll give you a little brief insight into how that's done. And introduce a fundamental concept for us, which is the control of criticality. So those of you who have a training in statistical physics, how you induce phase transitions in social systems. So I know this is a very mixed crowd, and so if you have any concerns, if it sounds like gobbledygook, just say, clarify, please, and I'll try. So let's talk about emergent order. So if you look at the world, I wondered if it would help having some of these lights. Would that help if some of the lights were dimmed here? You know, it's not thermodynamic equilibrium, right? This is extraordinarily structured, and it doesn't have any technology in it, doesn't have culture in it, but there are clearly a confluence here of organic laws and abiotic laws, right? In other words, something is structuring the natural world, and we've all been, since the 17th century, trying to understand the fundamental principles that structure the universe. And one way to think about this is to sort of take order and sort of, in some sense, project it through a prism. And there are 3, I think at this point, large-scale ways in which we can reason about the world. One is in terms of, and I'll explain what each of these are, self-organization. One is in terms of selection, think Darwin, population-based structure. And the other is programming. So if you look at any given system and say, why is it behaving as it does? Why is it producing an ordered output? These are the 3 ways largely in which you would try and explain that. And in any given system, these are all entangled. And so I have the prism here to demonstrate that they can be decomposed. So what are these things? Well, this is one way of thinking about it. Here's information that lives outside of the system in question. So let's imagine we can draw a boundary around it. It could be a car, right? It could be a body, it could be a brain. And here's information that lives within the system. Yeah, thank you, that's better. So down here we have a low amount of information coming from the world, right? And a large amount of information being endogenous to the system. So think galaxy. If you look at a galaxy, look at large-scale structure in the universe, we know exactly how that's generated and that's generated by the inverse square law. So gravitation and mass and initial conditions is sufficient to give us large-scale structure in the universe. There's nothing endogenous. If I know the masses and I know the initial momenta, I'll get it. That's wonderful. In some sense, it's what a lot of us want to generate. We want to, in some sense, outsource the information that would necessarily have to come from the environment and give it to the agent and allow the agents to self-organize according to some appropriate model. This is thermodynamical equilibrium. This is where you have no structure of any kind in the world. Up here is selection, right? So selection says everything that you observe was put into the system by the environment. So think about a DNA molecule. If you think about the sequence of nucleotide bases, A, C, G, and T, the particular sequence that you observe is not an intrinsic property of the DNA molecule. It comes from an interaction with the environment and the process of differential selection. So the information in the molecule is conferred by information in the world. And programming is this interesting new phenomena, at least when we do it, which is information from the environment, namely me, being put into a physical system, namely a microprocessor. So that has self-organization and selection-like properties. Okay. And a lot of what we've been asking ourselves and our partners, Google Research, for example, is how do you turn, in some sense, a programming problem where a huge amount of information has to come from experts into something more like a self-organization problem, where you can disperse the information into basic rules that the agents have, and they endogenously create the desired input-output functions. So that's the sort of dream of self-organization, if you like. Turn computers into galaxies. Another way to think about it is in terms of this alternative set of axes, robustness versus adaptability. So here everything is shuffled somewhat. Programming is actually terrible in the sense that it's not at all robust. So if you write code and someone goes in and messes with it, chances are you'll have messed up the desired function. And it's also not at all adaptable in the sense that it's very specific to the domain in question. So actually, I just came out of a meeting yesterday on the barrier of meaning in artificial intelligence, and we had some of the Google Go people there. And one of the interesting points made by the whole DeepMind crew is that, as you know, if you take a breakout game and you move the position of the bat that the algorithm has been trained to play just by a millimeter, the entire algorithm fails. So it's extraordinarily brittle with respect to the design of the problem. In contrast, for example, to self-organization, where I can perturb the positions of planets in the solar system, and they'll return to their basins of attraction, as long as the perturbation is not too big. So you get a huge amount of robustness in a self-organized system, but not a lot of adaptability, because the particular thing it does, the one thing it does, the orbits, it does very well, but with very little variation. And yet, there, over here, we have life, and life has these interesting properties of everything we want, right? You have extraordinary adaptability, but also extraordinary robustness. And so in this two-dimensional plot, this is what people want. They want to move from a world of brittle, overfitted programs to a world of highly adaptable and robust systems. So this is the big question, I guess. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about each of these to give you a sort of sense of what they are. So here's self-organization. I already mentioned this. It's the extraordinary inverse square law, sort of quasi-independently discovered by Maxwell and Newton, that this property of what's called conformability, that the same mathematical relations are scale invariant. So what happens with at the scale of electromagnetism also applies at the scale of gravity, at very large scales. And you can explain patterns like these in very, very simple terms. And those kinds of models are known as force models, and we spent the last 20 years at SFI showing how those models can be extended to explain the patterns of traffic, flocking in birds, shoaling in fish, and I'm sure you've all seen videos of these things over the course of time. And they're interesting because they're very simple rules that give you desirable outputs. They're robust, but they're not very adaptable. So if you said, I want to change the configuration of this system to achieve a slightly different pattern of shoaling or flocking, it would be extremely difficult to accomplish. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a second. The canonical book on self-organization in our community is this book that was written in 1917 called On Growth and Form. It's a beautiful book, by the way. You can still buy it. Dover has a reprint of this book. And Darcy Thompson was a mathematician and a classicist, and he was fascinated in forms like spirals. And here is sort of a random selection that Stephen Wolfram put together, actually, of pages from Darcy Thompson's book. Stephen is a big admirer of this book, and so you can sort of see how all of these types of patterns Darcy Thompson tried to explain in terms of very simple physical law, not selection, right? In other words, just change the physics slightly, get a completely different shell morphology or a different fish shape. The person who really, in some sense, consolidated the field of self-organization was Alan Turing. And Alan Turing, many of you will know. You'll know him from his work on the Enigma. You'll know him on his theory of incompleteness in relation to Gödel's theorem and undecidability. And you might not know him, you know, from the Imitation Game, where you probably mistake Alan Turing for Cumberbatch. But what he did in his late life, before he killed himself, was work on morphogenesis. Turing was fascinated by things like this, spirals and dots and zebra stripes and leopard spots. And he developed a whole series of mathematical formalisms to explain the emergence of those patterns. And for those in the room with an engineering or a mathematical background, this is the famous two-dimensional reaction diffusion system that Alan Turing wrote down, which many of us have worked on for the last 50 to 70 years. It's an extremely profound contribution, actually. And now we know, as of the last couple of years, that there is a generalized theory of Turing's pattern formation theory, which allows us to design, based on graph-theoretic principles, a whole class of patterns with minimal knowledge of the particular parameter values that need to be established. So it's a kind of design principle for developing patterns. And it's important to point out that these patterns only require knowledge of interactions, that we have, say, a positive interaction, excitatory or inhibitory interaction, and that we have different rates of motion. And so these systems of equations are very general. And so again, if you're interested in building a certain kind of stable structure in the world, we now have an understanding of what the design elements are for the production of those stable patterns. And again, so this is just some SFI work over the years that has this flavor of being involved with self-organization. Tom Ray, many years ago, when he was at SFI in the 80s, invented this system called Boyd. How many people have heard of Boyd's? One, okay, good. Two, yeah, Boyd's was the kind of first famous example of simple rules for flocking, and it was the inspiration for the early sim games, if any of you ever played Sim City and so forth. Tom Ray went to work for them, and that's where it found its profitable expression, not in science. Chris Langton's work on self-replicating automata, building on John von Neumann's work from the 50s, and then the origin of life and prebiotic chemistry. So these kinds of principles have found expression in these fields. So now let's talk a little bit about programming. So programming, in some deep sense, is the regulation of self-organization. Right? If I give you a computer, it's a physical system. It's a material object that has to obey the laws of physics. But I'm going to establish boundary conditions such that that physical object performs computational work. And there's a kind of interesting history here. Who in this room knows John Conway? Who's heard of the Game of Life? A few more people, great, okay. More and more, as we move along, hopefully more and more arms will go up. So this is John Conway when he was at Princeton. And John Conway read a chapter in this very famous book that was edited by Claude Shannon and John McCarthy, who I'm sure many of you know. And in that book was a chapter by John von Neumann. And John von Neumann created the von Neumann architecture that we are all dependent on in our computers. And this was a paper on fault-tolerant distributed systems. So this is the foundational paper in fault-tolerant computing. And it's something I've worked on quite a lot, this particular area. And actually, it was inspired, this paper, by a conversation with one of our founding professors, Murray Gell-Mann, who won the Nobel Prize in 1969 for the discovery of the quark. And reading that paper, John Conway came up with this wonderful little simple, discrete dynamical system called the game of life. And I'll show you a little video of it for those who haven't seen it. It's essentially a square lattice. Every cell has a simple rule, and if that cell has less than 2 neighbors, it dies. If it has 2 or 3 neighbors, it survives. If it has strictly 3 neighbors, it replicates. And if it has more than 3 neighbors, it dies. At 4 neighbors, it's crowded. So it's a very simple set of rules for living, dying, and being born. And out of that, if you just set it up with some arbitrary initial condition, you start producing very intriguing patterns. And this is the game that led to Stephen Wolfram's entire career, which was trying to understand the mathematical principles that lie behind this kind of structure. And for those who don't know this work of his, you probably know that Wolfram Alpha is the intelligence engine behind Siri, so that's how you know Stephen's work. So anyway, these are really interesting things, and again, people who've been interested in collective phenomena have been obsessed with these. Very simple rules producing rather surprising patterns, and perhaps the most surprising pattern of all is if you configure them in just the right way, you can build a Turing universal computer. So this is exactly the same rules I just showed you, but it's sort of zoomed out. We've built a structure, that's the initial condition. It turns out that this structure is a universal Turing machine, meaning in principle it could run something like Word. Okay? So in other words, it's got that property. And this again has generated a great deal of excitement because it says, well, look, if the individual agent is only aware of its local circumstance, it's following extremely simple rules, but the collective can be engineered to do universal computation, maybe that's the future of economies and maybe that's the future of blockchain, right? In other words, what we want to do is radically decentralize. We want to minimize local information, but somehow engineer the collective to be able to produce arbitrarily complex functions. There's a huge problem with the field, and it's this. We now know from the last few years that this question of which rules will generate interesting aggregate behavior is Turing undecidable. What that means is you cannot know in advance whether the rules that you picked are the ones that will give you, in the aggregate, in the emergent dynamics, any interesting behavior at all. There's just no way of knowing, and it's provable there's no way of knowing. So this is a problem if that's your game, right? So what you have to do is you have to sort of, with every rule system, run it and play with it and engineer it and kludge solutions because there's no way of knowing it in advance. It's a really profound result that for many of us working in this field is problematic because it tells us that top-down control is not gone because there's no way of knowing in advance whether your bottom-up rules will produce the governance structure with a desirable output, provably. So it's a big result. The other big idea in this sort of programming of self-organizing systems came from Waddington in 1942, and he had this wonderful metaphor that by now is pretty well known of the epigenetic landscape. How many people have heard of Waddington or the epigenetic? Yes, actually, that's interesting. So it's more biological. And what Waddington said is, any system that's changing in time can be construed as a coordinate on an energy landscape. So those of you with physics backgrounds, that'll be very familiar. And so all of these points on this landscape correspond to a particular structure or configuration And that ball rolls down that landscape and ends up in a well, which is the fixed point of this system. And so the system is subject to buffeting from the environment and has a very physical-like dynamics. But the thing, and so, for example, in the Darcy-Thompson language, each of those wells might be a different shape, of a fish or something. It's just a slight pedibation of the trajectory of the dynamical system produces a different outcome. But the particular structure of the landscape is undergirded by a program. And these little sticks represent that program. Okay, so biological life, our bodies, we develop over the course of time, and from an embryo. That's this rolling down the hill. There are different possible outcomes according to the environments in which we live, right? But undergirding it and supporting that trajectory is a complex pattern of gene regulation. And so this is a very important bit of work in biology, in genetics, that's associated with a Nobel Prize, which was the discovery that the genome could be construed as a program. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting thing that if I ask many of you what's genomics or genetics about, you might say, well, there are these genes and they're factors, and somehow those factors contribute to traits. So there's a gene for height, or there's a gene for eye color, or there's a gene that gives you a proclivity towards cancer. We now know that that's a little bit like looking at code, and it's like asking you what is a statement like an if-then doing, right? Or a go-to function, or a while function. It's not quite the right interpretation. What these genes are the elements of a grammar, of a computational language that's evolved. And that's the appropriate way to think about what a genome is. And this is some recent work in the last 20 years that really tries to make that explicit. So if you ask me now what a genome is, it's this. The genome is a stochastic circuit that we can represent in terms that would be very familiar to engineers. And that circuit generates pattern. And a few years ago, we tried to derive the formal language of these circuits to try and establish what kind of computational device is a genome that somehow works with physics to produce desired order. And the current sort of state of the art is hybrid dynamical systems. So again, it's something I think some of you will be familiar with, which is the idea that you sort of combine the world of Alan Turing, continuous dynamical systems that produce pattern, self-organization, with logic circuitry, which is discrete transitions between continuous dynamical systems. So this is sort of where we are now. It's trying to understand how discrete logic interacts with continuous manifolds and dynamics. Okay, so that was self-organization, bit of programming, and now I want to talk about selection. Selection is actually the very hardest principle. It's the one associated with Darwin. It's the one that most people think they understand but don't. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of what makes it difficult. What selection fundamentally is, it's a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics says that entropy should always increase. So if I showed you a picture like this, and I gave you a multiple choice exam, which I will, and I said, and it's not a hard multiple choice exam, I don't think, and I said, which way do you think time moves, left to right or right to left? Left to right, right? And anyone could have answered that, I hope. And right, and what's happening, and this is just an instance of the second law, that entropy in a closed system will always increase. Okay, but now look at this picture. Oh, that's Arthur Eddington. This is the original definition of the arrow of time, which, by the way, is an area of a 5-year initiative at SFI now on the foundational theory of time, from space-time in quantum gravity through to time in society. But here's the original one. Let us draw an arrow arbitrarily. If, as we follow the arrow, we find more and more of the random element in the state of the world, then the arrow is pointing towards the future. If the random element decreases, the arrow points towards the past. I should use the phrase times arrow to express this one-way property. So it's very interesting, by the way. It says that because we know that physical law is time symmetric, quantum mechanics, classical mechanics, and so on, relativistic mechanics, the only way we know the difference between the past and the future is because of the amount of disorder in the system. That is the arrow of time. There isn't an asymmetry in the fundamental laws. And so, which is slightly, I think, surprising to people, right? That the only sense in which there is a difference in the future and the past is by randomness. So in other words, if there wasn't any, memory would be the same as prediction. Okay. So here's the Darwinian case. If I said to you, in this case, by the theory of adaptation by natural selection, which way are we going from left to right or right to left? Right to left, gold star. And that's right. And because you know that this one looks more adapted, right, to that particular circumstance than the one on the right. And this is a very famous case that we all learned in high school, which is industrial melanism in the north of England. Well, in England, we learned this in high school. This is how evolution works. And here's Ronald Fisher defining the evolutionary arrow of time. And this is actually really kind of difficult to pass, I think. R.A. Fisher, you know from statistics, probably, maximum likelihood, and so forth. It was Darwin's chief contribution, not only to biology, but to the whole of natural science, to have brought to light a process by which contingencies a priori improbable order are given in the process of time an increasing probability until it is their non-occurrence, randomness, rather than their occurrence which becomes highly improbable. It's the absolute opposite of Eddington's arrow of time. What the selection process does, it makes very improbable things very probable. And the way that everyone here is taught this fundamentally is in terms of things like adaptive landscapes, where if you start in some very probable regime, that is where your system doesn't work. There are many, many ways of things not working. Over the course of time, somehow, through the selection process, you move to the one singular state associated with function. And of course, as I said, there are many, many ways of being not very good, and that's why it's the reverse of entropy, right? And here is the simple theorem that Fisher showed in the 30s, which was his attempt to show what Darwinian evolution fundamentally is. It's not the increase in entropy, it's the increase in some other property, and it was called the Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection. It's wrong, and what Fisher thought is what always gets reduced by evolution in any system is variance. And anyone here does Bayesian inference? Are you Bayesians? That's exactly Bayes' rule. Exactly what Bayesian particle filter does. Bayesian updating, the learning rule, it minimizes the variance of a distribution, right? Until you know with a delta function exactly what the system state is, given enough observations. And I actually proved, just many years ago, the equivalence of Bayesian inference to this framework. And so it turns out, rather interestingly, that a lot of machine learning, a lot of inferential frameworks are actually equivalent, isomorphic mathematically, to the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is maybe not surprising to some of you, but maybe surprising to others. The problem with Fisher's theory that somehow selection always minimizes the variance is we know it's not true. So if you, who knows the game rock, paper, scissors? Oh, everybody doesn't. I knew eventually everyone was going to put their hands up. And what is the optimal solution in that game? What's the solution that guarantees that over the long duration you'll maximize your payoff? Uniform random, right. Because, and the so-called Nash equilibrium of the rock, paper, scissors game is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Because if I play any one strategy, right, you'll say, if I just say I'm always going to play rock, you'll say I'm going to play paper. But if I always play paper, you'll say I'll play scissors. And if I always play scissors, I'm going to play rock. So there's never one strategy that's optimal. And so the Nash equilibrium of this game is uniformity. Second goal, you're like in the lead. And so, and this shows that Fisher's result is not right, because Fisher said the variance should always be reduced, And you've just told me that in this instance, the variance should be maximized. And so I just show you a little bit of equation because I need to show you what we do. And a while ago, we showed that what was being maximized was something very different, and it's this quantity, which is that evolution by natural selection, Bayesian inference, the free energy principle, pattern theory, whatever framework you work in, maximizes the mutual information. What these systems are doing, essentially, is extracting as much information from the environment as they possibly can. That's what evolution does. It takes information from the world and puts it in your genome. So that's this stuff. So basically, we had a kind of a very rapid tour of 3 different kinds of frameworks for thinking about order, right? And there are these trade-offs in every single one of them. The self-organizing framework, which is, I think, what the whole blockchain community is fascinated by, is can we produce truly decentralized governance? Yes, if it's simple and it will give you a certain robustness. But if you want true adaptability, you're not going to get it out of self-organization itself. And moreover, you can never know in advance what the rule systems are, the laws, if you like, or the agreements that will guarantee the emergent property of interest. It's Turing undecidable. So there are some really interesting theory, you can sort of see theoretical underpinnings to the sort of world that you're all experimenting in. So now I'm going to do quickly 2 examples of principles. Is this good? We okay? I've got time? Okay. I just want to make sure people aren't super... Well, I don't want to be super saturated by all this dorkiness. So I want to move to 2 instances which give us insights from how real complex systems, the brain and conflict or warfare, but I'll talk about a very particular case today, give us, I think, insights, I hope, that would be useful in your world as you're thinking about design of some of these decentralized systems for exchange. So here we are, and it's sort of yellow. This kind of wake people up. It's like, sort of intense. I don't think I've ever used a yellow background. It's sort of incredibly intense. And so it's sort of very New Mexican. And so the 2 ideas I'm going to try to get across to you is what's called dual coding theory and near-critical dynamics. And I know this is kind of ruthlessly mean thing to do for breakfast. But actually, the ideas are intuitive, I think, even though whatever demonstration and technical rigor that goes into their exposition might not be. So I'm going to do a little test. This is your second test of the morning. And it's based on a real test. This is work that we've done with our collaborators at Stanford. And I'll show you what it is in a second. But basically, you have a monkey. It's looking at a screen. So this is a test given to a monkey, by the way. And so, and it does really well in this test. Although I heard yesterday Irene Pepperberg give a talk, and she said that parrots in logical disjunction tasks, like the exclusive OR function, perform to the level of an 8-year-old human. I'm completely shocked by that, actually. So simple logical propositions expressed in terms of, like peanuts under shells, or they do as well as 8-year-olds. So what we do is we show these monkeys a video screen, and there are dots on the screen, and the dots flow either left or right. Okay? And the way to think about this is they flow right or left with a probability 1, in which case you get laminar flow, or if they flow, there's a probability of a half, it looks like chaos, it looks like noise, right? Because they just, okay? So I'm going to ask you, once you've reached a certain level of certainty, whether the dots I show you are going left on average or right. If you get it wrong, you get penalized. No, but that just, shout out once you know. That's the point. Don't shout out immediately. So here we go. Here are the dots. We're going to start with this one. That's awesome. You basically answered the question, right? What do you think? Back and forth, right? So your delay, it's interesting, your nervous system just told you what the probability was. Because you couldn't decide, you just told me that they're going left and right with probability of half, right? That's what you just told. Your nervous system told you that. How about that one? Net left. Okay, so there is a very well-known phenomena in cognitive science called the speed-accuracy trade-off. And the longer you wait, the more accurate you get, right? And so when you make decisions, snap decisions, you tend to be wrong. And if you integrate for long enough, you tend to be right. But you'll notice that that depends on the complexity of the task. That when I gave you a half-half, you used to wait forever because you couldn't integrate enough information to know because it's random. Whereas with these cases, you got faster according to how clear the signal was. So this is very well known. That's the task that monkeys can solve also very accurately. And this is what we do. It seems a little mean. We have monkeys in the monkey brain in a region called the lateral interparietal cortex. We have a microelectrode array of 169 microelectrodes. Each electrode records from a single neuron. We collect spikes. We use spike sorting on that. And what we do is we do essentially mind reading. We say, can we know what the monkey saw before the monkey says? Where is the information in the brain that allows it to make the decision? So I want to be clear about why this matters. This is a decentralized system. In this case, it's only like 160 cells. Each cell is receiving an input from, essentially now in this case, V5. Yes?
How do you choose the neurons?
Oh, that's interesting. That's a good question. So we've known from many prior studies that this part of the brain has been associated with motion detection. That's a whole history unto itself. But that's basically why. Yeah, it's not a random selection. By the way, it's a very interesting question. There's a theory called the holographic theory of the nervous system that would tell you that it wouldn't matter which 169 cells. That every single cell encodes part of every solution, which is totally bizarro, right? There's no way 86 billion cells know everything about every input. But there is such a theory, and there is some evidence for a weakened variant of the idea. So all signals are sort of being projected lots of places, and if you just had enough detection accuracy, you might be able to pull it from very unlikely suspects. So for example, visual cortex gets information from auditory. Auditory cortex has visual input from your eye. So you could, if you had a super high-resolution sensor, you might be able to hear with your visual system. But that's a kind of interesting design property of the nervous system. So this is maybe a little bit more complicated, but just it's sort of the task I gave you. It's like you look at the screen, and rather than you just shouting out left or right, I give you a time to sort of assimilate, and then I say, what do you think it was, left or right? So it's a bit different. And here's what we find when we record from all the neurons. And this looks technical, but it's a profound problem that we've now discovered is true generally in every information processing system that we've studied that's decentralized. What we're looking at here is the collective predictive power of the cells that we measure from. And what you see is that there are some population of cells that know nothing, ever. Okay? That's these. There's some population of cells that seems to gradually become more and more certain, as you all did, watching it for longer and longer, and then they reach the maximum certainty at the go cue, like which way did it go? And then there's another really interesting population of cells that doesn't know very much until the go cue, right? And then it seems to know everything. So does anyone here would hazard an explanation for how the yellow ones work? Or the red ones? What's going on here? And just to put this into sort of relief, if I had a room of folks like this, and I was giving you information and testing you every now and then, and you didn't know anything, that's the yellow ones, and then at some terminal point, somehow you knew everything, how could that be? Yes, that's great, cheat, exactly, yeah. So you would be using someone else's information, right? That's exactly right. And so what we've discovered, and don't worry about the details here, this is what's called dual coding theory, is that 3 different systems we've studied, a technological system, actually web search, actually, a ant foraging system, and the nervous system, all do two things. They have a first phase, which is the wisdom of crowds phase. They all independently sample the world. It's like everyone in this room, no one talk to anyone else, come up with what you think the best solution is. And then there's a critical moment where you all talk to each other. And the person who's most certain convinces everyone else that that's the right answer. Now, that comes with huge liabilities, right? Because if that person, as we know from Danny Kahneman's work, certainty is often inverse proportional in correctness. And so if someone's really certain, it's like, maybe it's like the second most certain person that you want to listen to. But nevertheless, this is very universal. It's very interesting. In design of a distributed decision-making system, you want to benefit from statistical independence, right? So you want everyone to be an independent sampler. Don't want them confounding, but then you want them to pool, and that is consensus. And I was kind of struck by Ithaca's new, Cornell's new sort of IC3, that they called their group, I think that it's, what is it, it's like crypto, consensus, and contracts. And consensus is a really important, under-theorized dimension of distributed decision-making systems. So that's this one insight from the brain. Dual coding. And actually, in anyone here who runs a company, that's exactly what you do. You don't make a decision with everyone together at once, because the loudest person in the room dominates. You have everyone independently polled, because then you're benefiting from the wisdom of crowds, right? And then you aggregate. You don't aggregate right away. It is guaranteed that the solution will be dominated by the loudest voice. And so, so I'll give you another example now of another principle. This is slightly more technical, but it might be interesting to you, those of you trying to think, what is a distributed system? So here's some work that we did at Emory, at Yerkes, and this was data all collected by Jessica Flack, who's a professor at the Institute. And we were interested in conflict, and we've now extended this actually to conflict in West Africa, so it's kind of an interesting study. And so you have individuals, and they fight each other. So these are monkeys, so here's 3 individuals, and they're all involved in a fight. And then they stop that fight, and then there are 2 individuals involved in a fight. So that's the structure of the time series. It's a discrete symbolic time series. It's like me and Caitlin fight, and then me and Caitlin and Chris fight, you know, so, and so on. So this is the data, and we want you to develop a new theory called inductive game theory. So for those of you familiar with game theory, and most of you I think will be because of the Byzantine generals problem, because it's such a critical area for blockchain design. But most game theory is idealized, and it starts with mathematical axioms. It doesn't start with data. It's one of the reasons why game theory has sort of been rather useless in the study of many complex systems, except as a source of toy models like the prisoner's dilemma or the ultimatum game or whatever you like. We're going to go the other way. We're going to say we're going to take data and we're going to induce from the data set the game structure. Very different kind of philosophy. Let's see. Okay. This is what we call a decision lattice. The basic idea is simple, and it says that 1-1 at the top says if I fight now, Caitlin will fight next time. So that tuple is t plus 1, one person fighting in response to another person fighting. This thing 1-4 says I'm fighting now, and 4 people will fight in the next fight. So you can see how this works. And down here it says there might be 3 people fighting, followed by 1 person in the next fight. So this is a 2-dimensional lattice. One axis measures coordination, because 4 people now have to coordinate after me, and the other one measures memory, which is that I have to remember 3 of you were fighting in the previous round. So this is the sort of logic. And with that lattice, we can go into the data and do some statistics, don't worry. This is sort of the typical Bayesian stuff. And what you get out of it is circuits. 5 minutes, great. Oops. And this is kind of important because I don't think people tend to think this way. What this is a logical swarm. So all of you are familiar with swarms, like birds and bees and so on. This is not a physical swarm. It's a swarm of logic. So each one of these nodes is an individual. And those arrows are decisions. So when they're connected, for example, this individual say, if I fought in fight T, that guy will fight in T plus 1. And that's how you read this kind of thing. And this one's in trouble. This one gets beaten up by everybody. Right? This is actually a really interesting individual. It's a conflict sink because all aggression terminates on them. They're very useful. but I mean, they're not very happy in their lives, but they kind of mop up all aggression. And you can find exactly the same kind of things here, by the way, in human conflict, as long as it's not lethal, because then it only happens once. And this is a slightly more complicated circuit. It says, this is like the one-to-one rule, right? So this is one individual inducing another. Combinatorially, much more elaborate are these rules that say, this one, EO, will fight if EO and QS fight. So there's like two individuals. And you can imagine like a 5-4. You can't actually represent these graphs visually. So I think the deep point here is we can actually represent a group as a circuit. And if we run the circuit, we can produce all possible behaviors that that group can generate. So this is a logical representation of a collective. Okay. And so you guys turn it on and predict who's going to fight next. And that's what we do. We say, who's going to fight, for how long, with whom? And you do that out of sample, of course. But you induce all of that structure from the data. And what we've discovered, let me see, I want to try and say this. There's a technical issue here. Let me sort of move to this, because I'm going to make the point through something you all know, okay, which is most of you have heard of the butterfly effect. How many people have heard of the butterfly effect? Excellent. This is it. This is the origin of that concept, the Lorentz attractor. And the Lorentz attractor was derived by Lorentz, a mathematician, to explain the movement of a particle in a heat bath heated from below. So imagine you just have a rectangle, and you put a flame under it, and you measure one particle dancing around as a function of being heated. And the coordinates of that particle are the coordinates of the three-dimensional dynamical system that Lorentz wrote down. And he found that there's an extreme sensitivity to initial conditions, the butterfly effect, such that if you take 2 points that are near neighbors and run that forward, at some point in the future, they'll be so far apart that you couldn't infer where they started. That your measurement device would have to be infinitely precise, which would require all the energy of the universe for you to do this accurately. So it's called deterministic chaos because there is a logical possibility of predicting the future in a chaotic system if your measurement is perfect. But perfect measurement means infinite energy. Not going to happen. And so, but where did Konrad Lorenz get that from? Where did that equation come from? It came from this equation. And most people don't know that. These are known as the Navier-Stokes equations, and some of you engineers will know these. These are the, these are the equations of fluids, and there's a systematic way of simplifying these equations to reach that. This is known as coarse graining. And the reason I mention this is because we now have a principled means of coarse graining social circuits. And I'm not going to talk about why it matters, but essentially, if I could now represent this room by observing you for long enough as a circuit with respect to some observable behavior, and I could run it to predict what you would do, the problem is those circuits become so huge and unwieldy that it's almost impossible to interpret them. This is why we live in the age of the ridiculogram, which are these stupid network plots that we all have to look at, which are unpassable, right? And so somehow they're sort of seductive to people because they're visually so fantastic, but they tell you nothing, right? So we have to take that circuit and compress it and turn it into the Lorentz attractor. And when you do that, you make a discovery, and I'm just going to tell you what it is, and that the discovery you make is that every adaptive system we've ever studied sits at a critical point, which means that it can be in a totally stable phase, ordered phase, or totally disordered phase, and a tiny perturbation of the system can move it between those two states. This is an empirical fact of the natural world, and it's an extremely surprising one, by the way. Right? So your nervous system sits between order and chaos. Sort of the, I think people have heard of these kinds of expressions, like the border of chaos or whatever you want. And this is actually quite a surprise, because if you think about engineering and building computers, the last thing you want to do is build these devices such that a tiny perturbation would completely disorder it. And yet, that's exactly what you are. And that's a big surprise, and it's something to take into consideration as you design these distributed systems. Do you want them to show this really weird property of being near critical points? So that was it. And the last, just telling you where this all fits into a particular case studies, and I just end with this quote from one of my colleagues, Murray, which I think is wonderful, where he says, think how hard physics would be if particles could think. We spent the last 30 years trying to work out what the theory is of thinking particles, and that's the theory of complex systems. I think it would be useful for what you do. This was a kind of very 30,000-foot intro to the ideas. Anyway, thank you.
Hi, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome me up. The how much work does Vitalik and the team have to do to build a truly decentralized sort of blockchain?
I'll tell you this afternoon. Can you give me a little more background on the nature of your question, and then perhaps I can.
Well, I think, as you say, it's very nascent. It's a very nascent sort of area that we're experimenting in. As you said, we're all experimenting in it. So. Is there any sort of visibility or thought about whether it's achievable to have a truly decentralized sort of system? When you've got the sort of order of corporations that are centralized and individuals that own sort of centralized systems, how does that play out when you're trying to build a decentralized? Yeah,
what I've been following, and I think everyone here, is the closed systems in Australia, etc. And so I think that. So just socio-culturally, where things seem to be moving at the moment is the acquisition of this so-called decentralized technology to centralize it, and where the economics are more sensible. My early discussions with them have to do with the energy scaling. And that's sort of where we're trying to look to systems of the kind that I studied to give a clue, because it's just ridiculous. Its strongest feature, right, which is the transparent distribution of the information, global distribution, is its greatest weakness. And that question about the nervous system was interesting, right? So the nervous system has a little bit of that, as I said, because every neuron, they encode more than you might imagine about a problem. But it's still modular. And so most of the visual information lives in V1, V5, not motor cortex, right? There's a little bit of redundancy. But not a lot. And so I think, there's hedging here. I think that somehow that system looks like it might give us clues to what we should be doing. And I think the idea of having total duplication is probably a no-go. And I think everyone here probably would agree with that, right? And so one of the problems, right, with a nervous system as opposed to the social system is that your nervous system is in the service of you. And so every neuron in your head really has your best interest at heart. And so there is a reason why you're allowed to not share the information globally, right? Whereas in the social system, that's not true. Because in the social system, there can be conflict between agents. And so that's closer to this world. So if there was, I guess another way of putting it is if we could aggregate our production into a common purpose, then there would be less of a need for total distribution, right? But we don't have a common purpose, and that's why we don't. So it's an interesting challenge. Yeah. So it's a game theory problem.
Thank you very much. That was
Yeah.
incredible.
Thank you. Yeah.